Fantastic. Thank you. Welcome to Grand Rounds of the Semel Institute. I just wanted to let folks know one note, closed captioning is available if you click the icon at the bottom of your screen. Today, I have the enormous honor and pleasure to be able to introduce April D. Thames, a PhD. So a warm welcome back for Dr. Thames, who was selected following a national search for what is a rare opening in the Division of Psychology at the Institute. And we're so delighted with the outcome. She joins us with an in-residence professorial appointment and is now the chief psychologist for the adult division of psychology in psychiatry and biobehavioral sciences, associate director of the Medical Psychology Assessment Center, and also directs an internship track to provide training and consultation liaison services for adults. I say welcome back because we've had the honor of participating in Dr. Thames' earlier career development after receiving a PhD in clinical psychology at CSPP Alliance in Los Angeles, and then an internship in clinical neuropsychology at Patton State Hospital. She joined our postdoctoral fellowship program under Dr. Charles Hinken, his T32, and engaged in both clinical work and HIV/AIDS research. Her amazing efforts led her to receive 4 grant awards prior to completing her postdoctoral training, and we were able to hire her as an assistant professor back in 2012. There was a dark period where Dr. Thames left us from 2018 to 2021 at an institution somewhere in Los Angeles, the name of which I cannot recall. But she has continued her stellar career, received 17 additional grants over the ensuing decade, now has 5 active grants from NIH, Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, Alzheimer's Association, and she's authored over 100 scholarly works with her contributions really exceptionally broad and far-reaching, extending from her earlier work in HIV/AIDS to address a range of other health conditions, including neuromedical illnesses broadly and Alzheimer's disease specifically. She's particularly remarkable in her capacity to learn new methods and apply these directly in her research. So she has, while doing everything else she does, learned genetics, cellular systems, neuroimaging methods, neuropsychological methods, and really embarked on community-based behavioral research that's incredible. Her career-long commitment to equity, diversity, and inclusion has been seen both in her research, which has long followed a community-based participatory model, and in her service. So for example, she's been the chair of the International Neuropsychological Society's Cultural Special Interest Group, served on the Minority Affairs Task Force of the ACNP, was the chair of the APA Division 40 for Ethnic Minority Affairs, and she's gotten multiple awards, well-deserved, for her work advancing minority group interests from the ACNP, Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, National Academy of Neuropsychology, AAMC, RAND Corporation, NIMH, and on and on. Anyhow, today we're really delighted to have Dr. Thames speaking to us on the topic promoting cognitive and emotional health in vulnerable populations through actionable science. Dr. Thames, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Biller. That was a very nice introduction, and I'm so happy to be here today and presenting on the first day of Black History Month, so I want to acknowledge that. And with that, I'll go ahead and I'll share my slides. So as Dr. Biller mentioned, I'll be talking about promoting cognitive and emotional health, but I've decided to shorten this to talk about brain health in vulnerable populations through action science. And I really have just 2 objectives today. One is to review determinants of brain health outcomes. And when I talk about brain health, please keep in mind that I am a neuropsychologist coming from the bias of neuropsychology. So I mention a lot about cognition, but cognition and mental health are so intertwined. We know that brain systems that we study and mental health conditions, as well as in neurodegenerative conditions, there's a lot of overlap. So I just, want to make that clear. And, hopefully by the end of my talk, I will propose some non-traditional approaches to science to optimize brain health in vulnerable populations. So as we think about the concept of brain health, the actual term is relatively new. If we look at publications in PubMed, it really wasn't until 2017 when people started using the term brain health in the literature. And it has a wide variety of definitions and models that are sort of used to think about what is brain health. And depending on what your research area is. You may use one or more of these models. I will be speaking today from the dynamic life course process model as well as the empirical reference models. I think these are models that I commonly use in my research. It's how I think about cognition and cognitive processes. And one being that, as I will describe throughout this talk, how brain health is really shaped by experiences and the environment, and thinking about how do we go about quantifying brain health over the course of the lifespan. So in taking the approach of a dynamic life course model, I think the social determinants of health is one that we can borrow, and I borrowed in my research to think about vulnerable populations and optimization of brain health. And I want to first talk about social position, because I think this is really important as we think about how is it that we are quantifying brain health over the course of the lifespan. Now, one term many of you may already know is that of cognitive reserve. This was a theory that was developed by Jakob Sturm at Columbia. This is just a theoretical diagram to explain about cognitive reserve. So if you have two patients, the patient on the left, and you have the patient on the right, patient 1 and 2, they both have some degree of cognitive reserve, but patient 1 has more cognitive reserve as depicted by the white bar. Both patients experience the same degree of neurological insult. But if you look at the functional impairment cutoff here, we can see this is an arbitrary cutoff, but we know that patient 2 is going to exhibit some of the adverse neurobehavioral manifestations of whatever disorder it is. And if we think about this, it's been mostly done in the Alzheimer's literature, the discussion around cognitive reserve, but I also think we see this in the psychiatric literature around, what I would call emotional reserve. We know about the vulnerability stress hypothesis of schizophrenia and other psychiatric disorders. And really it's about how much somebody has, how much capacity, how much resiliency does someone have. That's going to sort of dictate how much of a challenge or an injury that one can sustain before adverse outcomes emerge. So we know that education in the context of Alzheimer's disease, we know that education is protective of Alzheimer's disease related impairments. And this is a graph sort of depicting, on the left axis, you have global cognitive functioning that's represented in Z-scores, and then on the y-axis, and on the x-axis, you have the summary measures of Alzheimer's disease pathology. And what you can see here is that the person with 22 years of education, even at the maximum degree of neuropathology, they're only going to drop about a half standard deviation in terms of their cognitive functioning. Whereas if you look at the person with 15 years of education, which is still high, but they're going to demonstrate, about a 2.5 to 3 standard deviation decline in cognitive performance. So again, going back to the reserve model, we know that education is protective. Now, where we start to see disparities, we know that education is not distributed equally across all populations. And this graph is from the National Center for Education Statistics, showing the number of ethnic racial minorities or ethnic racial groups, that are represented in high poverty versus low poverty schools. We see that there's a disproportionate rate of Black and Latino students in high poverty schools, and there's a greater representation of white and Asian students in low poverty schools. So this has several implications, because for one, not having the financial resources not only affects physical resources that are available, but we also know that it correlates with teacher quality. And teacher quality is probably a very good proxy for the type of education that one has received. And we know that in the high poverty schools, we tend to see more teachers who are employed without credentials. And often there's these emergency credential hires. And so we think about, yes, you can have two people that have had both 12 years of education, but if one's come from a low poverty school and the other one's come from a high poverty school, there's going to be differential experiences and exposures that are going to have an impact on cognitive testing. So here, what we see, this is back from 2001, but not a lot has actually really changed in terms of our understanding how certain groups can be misclassified as having cognitive impairment. So the y-axis represents the number of individuals who are misclassified as having cognitive impairment. So you can see here on the left, if we look at, this is using the WAIS IQ test. And this was done in 2001. So this was back with an older version of the IQ test, but nevertheless, we can see that if we just apply age corrections to test data, both African Americans and Hispanics have high percentage rates of misclassification as compared to whites. Even if we apply age, education, and gender corrections, we still see that in particular African Americans have these higher misclassification rates. So the question is, well, why is that? And going back to what I was previously showing in the graphs with related to educational quality and socioeconomic status, we have been more aware in the field of neuropsychology that it's not just about how many years of education did one receive. And this is a nice series of studies that actually look at sort of SES and in terms of exposure. And the Jordan study, the Case and Griffith, and the Saxe study all looked at people who are either of lower SES or higher SES on a math problem solving. And so on the graph on the left shows that basically if these participants are given physical objects to solve math problems, they all perform equally well. But the graph on the right shows without physical objects, that's more influenced by educational opportunities and socioeconomic status. We can see that the higher SES groups tend to perform better than those with lower SES, but we don't see this problem when physical objects are given. So it begs the question about, is the problem that we see with these cognitive misclassifications, is it related to how we measure cognitive ability? Now, I want to talk about some of the limitations of the measures that we use and what we've seen over time in the literature. For one, we have problems with test stimuli. Now, a colleague of mine, Desiree Bird, from City University, New York, Queens College, she spearheaded this, sort of call to action paper about creating an anti-racist psychology by addressing professional complicity and psychological assessment. And the example here that was given was with respect to the Boston naming test. Now, the Boston naming test has been used for several years as an object naming task. So the idea is that if you're measuring language function, then you would present a picture to your examinee and then they would name what that is, and then you can assess for various types of language problems. But nevertheless, the idea of the test was to assess language function. Now, there's one item on the test that all of us knew, all the authors on this paper have, known to have a reaction in particular with our African American patients. And that is item number 48, which is the picture of a noose. And although this has been known for quite some time, this test has been, updated in its versions, and it's only until recently that people have now been excluding the item of the noose from the Boston naming test. So you can imagine, though, if we think about history and what the noose actually represents for African Americans, what type of emotions are going to emerge while performing this test. And I can tell you that as a neuropsychologist, I had people refuse to name what that item was. Another issue with our cognitive testing is we fail to account for cultural style. And this was illustrated really nicely in Desiree Bird's work, looking at the cancellation task. So this is a measure usually of processing speed, psychomotor processing speed, and vigilance or visual attention. So here you're looking at the shape at the top, and then you go through to kind of mark out anytime you see a shape that looks like it. Now, what Desiree Bird found in her study was that African Americans and Hispanics took longer to complete this task, as represented by the completion time in seconds, but the numbers of omission errors were about the same across all three racial ethnic groups. And so what we learned from this particular study is that our African American and Hispanic patients tended to compromise speed for accuracy. Now, the test is scored based upon how long it takes the participant to complete it. So you have to ask, is trading speed for accuracy, is that really a cognitive impairment, or is this just a cultural style as it refers to time? Another issue with some of our testing is the issue of familiarity. And this is a study from the UK that actually looked at the mini mental status exam and its components, and looking at the sort of different components such as orientation to time, orientation to place, memory, language, and visual spatial skills, and found across a number of studies that really, there were cultural and educational influences in terms of how familiar people were with these exams. So it really begs the question of the tools that we're using to measure brain health, in particular cognitive function. We need to start thinking about how do we optimize these measures. So there are some, solutions that, I've been thinking about for quite some time. One is that, really involving community stakeholders. And Dr. Kenneth Wells, who's here at UCLA, has done this type of work, in particular with the Community Partners in Care study, looking at depression measures with the community and actually determining if the language that's actually used in these measures, is it applicable, and found that the term depression is not really, for example, big in the African American community to use. So I think we can take the same approach with cognitive measures in terms of thinking about test stimuli, thinking about familiarity, and being more inclusive of how we develop our psychometrics. I want to point out some of the work that Dr. Stephen Reese and Dr. Bob Bilder have done with using sophisticated psychometrics, such as item response theory, to look at traditional measures. And this is an example from Dr. Bilder's National Neuropsychology Network has a large variety of patients who have completed several cognitive measures. And this is from the matrix reasoning test, which is a test of sort of visual spatial problem solving. And what they found here using item response theory and then also computer adaptive testing is that they could reduce the matrix reasoning test from 26 items, which is pretty burdensome, time consuming, down to 10 items essentially. And for most people, you can still get the latent trait as little as 5 items. And there's also this item response theory approach that we used quite some time back, looking at the Alzheimer's disease assessment scale and comparing what happens if we add items that are, tap into executive functioning processes and use items that tap into functional abilities. And we found that in terms of predicting those who convert from a mild cognitive impairment stage to a dementia, the revised ADAS plus executive functioning and functioning abilities using IRT methods best distinguish those who are likely to convert. So I think with the combination of community input, improved psychometrics, this might be one avenue to sort of address the limitations that we've historically seen with other cognitive measures. Now, thinking back to this dynamic life course model, one that's particularly important when we're thinking about vulnerable groups is socioeconomic and political context. And how does that shape policy? How does it shape cultural norms, societal values? Because this also plays into the role of health as well as brain health. So I always like to point out that we are social animals, and hopefully some of you have heard, of the book, The Social Animal. I think it's really good at explaining how we as humans value being connected to others, particularly for our survival. And we all know that in life, in terms of resource access, it's almost who that can really help along that way. So you can imagine groups that are isolated either due to racism and discrimination, victimization, physical violence. These are all very clear social threats. And I just want to give a shout out to Dr. Steve Cole, as well as Dr. George Slavich, on their sort of work in the area of looking at this conserved transcriptional response to adversity, because it's the idea that these social threats can actually have an impact on innate immune functioning and actually change the way genes express themselves, how they turn on and they turn off, in order to promote the inflammatory response or promote the antiviral response. And this had been a concept that had been looked among a number of socially isolated groups. But what I was interested in particular was looking at, with all the studies that were already published, particularly by David Williams and his group, looking at discrimination and health outcomes. And we also know that we see Black-white differences in peripheral inflammation. We see Black-white differences in chronic medical conditions, etc. I wanted to understand, would we see Black-white differences in this conserved transcriptional response to adversity, which is the way that leukocyte genes are expressed? And lo and behold, we were able to recruit participants who either self-identified as African American or European American. They completed a number of measures related to depression, perceived stress, and racial discrimination and socioeconomic status. And we did blood draws in order to get RNA, and we found that the only Black-white differences that we saw in terms of our behavioral measures was on our measure of perceived discrimination. So in looking at, well, the first question, do Black participants and white participants differ on these genes that sort of are turned on and turned off as part of innate immunity? We saw that this is a ratio of African Americans' sort of gene expression of these different transcriptional factor genes relative to Caucasians. They showed increased expression of these particular activator protein, as well as NF-kappa B. These are transcriptional factors that regulate inflammation responses. We see interferon regulating factor, which is a transcriptional factor involved in both innate and adaptive immunity as it pertains to the antiviral response, and also with these stress signaling genes were all elevated in our African American sample relative to our Caucasian sample. So we wanted to understand why. We weren't just happy with saying that there were differences, but we wanted to get into what was potentially driving that. So we looked at socioeconomic status, and actually socioeconomic status was very similar between the two groups. And that's just by way how we recruited our sample. But we did not see differences between the racial groups on general levels of perceived stress, nor did we see differences in other medical conditions. But what we did find is that when we accounted for experiences with racial discrimination, which had differed between the groups, we saw that the the sort of black-white difference on those transcriptional genes that promote the inflammatory response reduced, as well as the stress signaling genes. So these results sort of beg to question that perhaps discrimination experiences, because it's a social threat and it's ongoing, and also we don't always know when we're being discriminated against, that it's a chronic social threat that might be having an impact on the way our innate and adaptive immune systems work. Now, related to the social threats, I want to talk a little bit about some of the work that has been done in stereotype threat. Now, stereotype threat is a social psychological concept that explains how certain stereotype groups who are aware of the stereotype against their group, they have a pressure essentially not to perform according to the stereotype if placed in a potentially evaluative situation. So the very first studies looked at race, then they looked at gender, and the race studies focused on Black participants versus white participants, and really sort of used the stereotype or focused on the stereotypes that Blacks underperform academically relative to whites. And I'll explain that study in a second, but this was a very classic study out of Stanford. They've now replicated stereotype threat in a number of groups, men and women, looking at math ability and sort of activating the stereotype that women are not as good at math. They've done a lot of studies around age and gait, etc. But what we know from all of these studies on a neural level is that the anxiety that emerges from the threat of being evaluated or judged negatively according to the stereotype actually consumes cognitive resources that would normally be allocated to successfully complete the task. And so what actually happens in turn is that that pressure not to perform according to the stereotype actually results in underperformance. And the initial study by Claude Still and Joshua Aronson at Stanford used students, essentially, and they gave them like a 10-minute test of verbal problems from the GRE. Now, there were 3 experimental conditions. The first condition was the diagnostic condition, where they actually gave instructions that would elicit the stereotype threat. And those instructions were essentially, some people don't perform as well on these type of measures. Whereas the other 2 groups, the non-diagnostic group and the challenge group, they were essentially told, just do your best. They were not given the instructions that certain groups don't do as well. And so what they found was that African Americans underperformed in the diagnostic group where the stereotype threat was elicited relative to the non-diagnostic group, or even the challenge group where they were told to do their best on these tasks. So this suggests that there's something sort of in the air, if you will, about the stereotype. And even if the stereotype is not made explicit, there can be enough that may actually trigger that evaluative, that negative evaluative fear. And a while back ago, when I was a postdoc, I received some funding to look at stereotype threat in the context of neuropsychological performance, because it made sense to think that it might affect neuropsychological performance, but we weren't sure if it would really carry out, if the effects would carry out across an entire battery of cognitive tests. And what we found essentially was that it did. We were able to replicate the stereotype threat effect. We only had 2 conditions. We had the threat versus the non-threat condition. We basically told participants in the threat condition that they would be taking tests, and certain groups don't perform as well on these tests. We didn't say which groups, but we just gave the same instructions essentially as the original study. Now, what we added to this was looking at, within our African American participant sample, we wanted to see how experiences with perceived discrimination would interact with the examiner's race. So whether or not the race matched or mismatched with the examiner, we wanted to see whether or not that would have any implication on performance. And what we saw essentially here is that for our African American participants who reported high levels of perceived discrimination experiences, when they were with a different race with a white examiner, we saw underperformance relative to if they were with an examiner of the same race. So we thought that was interesting because it sort of gives an interaction between someone's experiences in their social world, how that comes into the context that's supposed to be controlled, such as a cognitive evaluation, to produce this kind of effect. Now, there is some work that suggests that there are ways to protect against stereotype threat. And one, just educating examinees about it has been demonstrated to be helpful. And people who tend to have a very strong and positive sense of ethnic identity or whatever identity it is that is being stereotyped against, they tend to actually be resilient against the effects of stereotype threat. And I think that's important because I know that there's some, good work going on here at Semel. I just want to give a shout out to Dr. Emnit Gamada, who has a really interesting project that is looking at the concept of Black joy. And it's really this idea of affirming this positive sense of self-ethnic identity. And also rapport building. And this is why this is very critical in these contexts. So now, sort of moving into this social determinants model, I want to talk a little bit about factors that sort of converge onto the healthcare, system. And we know that with regard to brain health, and I mean both cognitive and psychiatric health, although I'm mostly focused here on the neurological consequences of chronic disease, but we know that many of these conditions are not only associated with cognitive impairment and stroke, but also with mental health problems as well. And as we think about, what are some of the factors that might be driving some of the cognitive consequences, this is a very simplistic explanation, but we think that inflammation and vascular compromise tend to be very common. So if we look at the percentage of people age 65 and older who report having these selective chronic health conditions, we see that African Americans are more likely to report hypertension as well as stroke, and both African Americans and Hispanics are more likely to have higher rates of diabetes. So we see a disparity here, which I like to show this cliff analogy by Kamara Jones. I think that this is the reality of our, system of healthcare, and that is that you're going to have people who are further away from the cliff because they have sort of better, what we call social determinants of health, and then you're going to have those that have less resources, less efficient social determinants of health, and they were closer to dropping off the cliff in terms of health. And as we see, even with secondary prevention programs, often it's the case that people who do not have the type of resources don't even have the opportunity for secondary prevention or safety net programs. And when we think about tertiary prevention medical care, we know that there are differences in the quality of healthcare, whether it's the ambulance travel time, going to the hospital, wait times, non-working equipment. We know that this is the reality of our healthcare system. So this is going to result in obviously a distribution difference in health and well-being. So earlier I talked about the different models and definitions of brain health. So one of the models is, how do we actually measure brain health? How do we measure disparities in brain health? And one way that many studies have tried to look at sort of a measurement is to look at biological aging and brain aging, and using some techniques such as looking at telomere shortening, cellular senescence, looking at epigenetic aging. With regard to the brain, we use neuroimaging to try to quantify gray matter, white matter, as well as cerebral blood flow. So these are factors that we've been trying to use. And I want to highlight, this is a study that was done by our group back in 2018 with an HIV positive population. We wanted to see, we already knew that HIV was associated with poor cognitive outcomes, but a lot has changed in the landscape of antiretroviral therapy. So we wanted to understand, well, if these people were virologically suppressed, how could we quantify this sort of brain age gap? So estimated brain age relative to one's chronological age. So Taylor Kuhn, who's on faculty here, had a really sort of great idea of collaborating with Cambridge Center for Aging and Neuroscience and the University of Oslo, because they had a large data set of people who were healthy, who had had DTI, diffusion tensor imaging, which is an imaging of white matter. They had undergone diffusion tensor imaging, and they had people's metrics from the age of 20 on up to 80. And we wanted to use machine learning algorithm to try to determine if we could come up with a regression model, essentially, to estimate one's brain age based upon their DTI data. And what we found, interestingly, is that we were able to come up with an algorithm, apply it to our HIV positive and our HIV negative data set here in LA. And what we found essentially is that our HIV positive participants had an estimated brain age that was higher than their chronological age. And we saw this more pronounced after the age of 60, which is actually very consistent with the aging HIV literature, that we start to see more of the discrepancy between the brain age process, the cognitive aging process, as people get older. So this is one way that we've tried to quantify brain health. Another way, this is a paper that was spearheaded by a student of mine who is interested in the concept of psychological grit. So many of you may have heard of the concept of grit. It has to do about perseverance. How does one persevere and sort of, through life challenges? Do they keep going? And we thought about grit as potentially a proxy of brain health, because earlier I mentioned about emotional reserve. We know cognitive reserve, there's also emotional reserve. Is grit a component of emotional reserve that can actually protect against poor outcomes? And what we looked at in this study was whether or not grit mediated the relationship between lifetime stress exposure and adversity, using the stress and adversity inventory by George Slavich that captures a wide range of lifetime exposures to stress and adversity. And we looked at whether or not it mediated the relationship on functional outcomes, and we saw that it did. So it's interesting in that we might be able to think of this concept of grit as part of, brain health, particularly a protective factor. So now I want to sort of end this talk on thinking about a new direction for how do we optimize brain health, particularly in our most vulnerable communities. Some of you may have heard about action science theory. It really is a theory of science that is focused on reflection and inquiry into the reason behind our actions. Now, you may be wondering, well, how does this have to do with science? Well, for one, if we are intentional in the way that we approach our studies, we sort of, we engage these mental models that really is the core concept of action science. Mental models have to do with our assumptions behind every sort of methodological step that we're taking. So it becomes problematic when our mental models or our way of doing things are untested. If we're looking at the lens of this, putting on our scientific hat and looking through that lens, we might be missing some components. And I think I illustrated that earlier with some of the development of certain measures that are supposed to get at cognitive ability. If we use action research, we can actually involve patients and public, particularly stakeholders, and people are starting to do this. I mean, they've been doing this, I won't say starting, but I think it's getting more traction in terms of recognizing that we have to think outside the scientific box, particularly for those of us who are working with people and wanting to optimize people's brain health, whether you consider that to be cognition or mental health well-being or both. And I think that moving forward, every step of what we do needs to be really carefully thought through, as opposed to the traditional, I want to do this study on X, so I'm going to recruit these participants by hanging up these flyers and use these measures that have been demonstrated to have reliability. That mindset is sort of where we've been for several years, and it might take thinking outside of the box to move forward. Because ultimately we want to achieve health equity. We want to be able to not have certain groups closer to the cliff than others. And even if they get to the cliff, we want to have an equity as it comes to secondary prevention and tertiary prevention. One solution for achieving this and sort of thinking about action-oriented science is building partnerships that are authentic, bidirectional, and sustainable. It's too often that we engage in partnerships when we have grant money to fund it, but then all of a sudden when that grant money goes away, those partnerships start to fall apart. And so it's really important to think about how to sustain and also build capacity within under-resourced communities. Because if we expect vulnerable populations to come to us, we are doing a disservice. And so we need to think about, well, how do we build capacity within the structures that people use? And leveraging social determinants of health data, start small, think about underlying factors that might be impacting health and brain health outcomes. We've tried this approach with a few projects I just want to highlight. We did a SISTAHS sexuality and mental health well-being project in collaboration with the late Miss Loretta Jones and Miss Felica Jones from the Healthy African American Families. This was very successful in sort of understanding, for older women age 50 and above, who are having sex, how are they protecting their sexual health as well as their mental health, and this was something that I could not have gone into this study knowing, what exactly, what kind of language to use or what kind of measures to use. This was really a collaborative process. I also want to highlight, another project funded through the Robert Wood Johnson program where we're using a mobile app for financial coaching to reduce financial stress. And this is in collaboration with, other academic partners as well as community partners. And the idea is that we're trying to get at those basic social determinants of health that really matter to people, and financial insecurity is huge. We also have a project in Uganda where it's called SUUBI for adherence, and SUUBI in Ugandan means hope. And the idea is that we're using an economic empowerment intervention to not only result in better health behaviors for youth who are living with HIV to be adherent to their medications, but we're also looking at how does this economic empowerment intervention have implications for mental health as well as cognitive health. And we're employing a lot of measures of which, as being the neuropsychologist on this study, I have recognized how our cognitive measures as we use them here in the US, they dramatically need to be revised for use with a cohort in Uganda. I've learned a lot from that. So with that said, I want to thank you all for listening, and I'm happy to take any questions in the remaining time that we have.
Thank you so much, Dr. Thames. This is an incredible scope of presentation, yeah, truly impressive work. Folks are welcome to submit questions in the Q&A at the bottom of your screen. But while we're waiting for those to come in, I'm gonna take my prerogative and ask a couple of questions, because there's so many great ideas that are stimulated by this work. One is, you mentioned some of the work that you're taking already and that you've already done using non-traditional approaches. I'm just wondering what other kinds of things you think might be good, especially when we're thinking about advancing cognitive and brain health, like here from UCLA and in Los Angeles. I know you've had some involvement in planning for our new hospital and expanding the Medical Psychology Assessment Center, or MPAC clinic. I just wonder if you could share some of those ideas with us.
Sure. I think one is that many people don't know, I've learned about what it is that I do as either a role of the psychologist or a neuropsychologist in particular. So one idea that I think is that we need to get information out to the community around brain health and how do we maximize that. So I hope that some folks can attend. There's a conference during Super Bowl weekend on Black men's brain health, but this is an example of a community led academic community partnered conference, if you will, that is giving information around the topic of brain health. So one is that we just have to educate people essentially about what it is that we do and how do they navigate the system. So one idea that I've actually been very interested in is the idea of peer navigators. And so we've seen this in a lot of other studies of, medication adherence or with mental illness, having a navigator to help navigate through health systems. I think we need that for cognitive health or brain health. And we also need to think about how do we build capacity within the spaces that people already use. So within churches, for example, or within community centers, within housing, facilities, how do we build capacity that we could do screening? And I think with the work that you've done, Bob, it's shown that we can, if we're intentional about the way we look at our cognitive measures or even psychological measures, can we get it down to where it's not burdensome and it's easily taught to people to administer in these various settings?
Fantastic. Thank you. Thank you. And we have some questions coming in from the crowd. First up, from Diana Lee Luxembourg. She asked, cultures differ in terms of how socially connected they are, like Sweden versus Italy, or Senegal versus South Africa, Protestants versus Catholics, Hasidic Jewish versus Reform Judaism. So the question is, might the factor of religion or non-religious influence influence brain health? What do we know about that?
Well, I think it's a good question. I think that there's a lot of work now around the benefits of social connectedness. And I think obviously we know that there are certain hormones that are, been released, in response to social connections. And we know that at least in the dementia world, that people who have strong social connections tend to do better in terms of cognitive decline. We also see this with health decline. And I don't think it's solely just because you have someone to help you. I think there's something about having that sort of shared experience of that bond that we just don't know enough about, but we know that it does promote health in a number of different ways. And I, can only imagine that religion being part of it, because it gives you a sense of identity and belonging to a group, which is essentially beneficial for brain health.
Fantastic. Now, while we're on the topic of brain health, another question's come in from Steve Shoptaw. Said your finding about brain aging in HIV is interesting. What might be the links between brain aging and substance use?
That's a good question. And I should say that with this population in particular, and with lots of populations, substance use is a huge issue that cannot be ignored. I didn't talk about it explicitly, but we do know that people who have, extensive substance use histories, we tend to see that they are more likely to have these poor brain health outcomes. But we don't know necessarily in some cases what comes first. Is it that the cognitive, sort of reserve, if you will, is already compromised, which would it then promote someone to engage with substances and make poor decisions, do substances themselves impact the brain? We know that it does. So I think that when we're thinking about these populations, we try to control as much as we can. But as you know, Steve, getting information about substance use of the past can be challenging in terms of whether people are telling us the truth. But I do want to say that, yes, I think that some of the studies that are following people longitudinally, particularly in the youth study that we have going on in Uganda, these are youth living with HIV. So we'll be able to sort of track, are the adolescents who are engaging in substance use behaviors, are they sort of coming in with more compromised brain function that might lead to that, or vice versa? So, but yeah, definitely a factor.
Wonderful, wonderful. Now we have another comment and question from Nancy Lee. The comment is, great presentation, exclamation mark.
Thank you.
The question, to clarify about grit, a psychological attribute that is both inherent at birth, but can it also be taught, like stress resiliency? Maybe could you provide a specific example of grit?
Sure. I actually, in preparation for the Blackman's Brain Health Conference, I was reading some articles that talk about resilience among Black men in particular. And in this article, they did qualitative interviews, and they asked these men, like, how do they cope with, the challenges that they experience in their day-to-day life? And consistently, the responses were, I just keep it going. If I don't get the job, I keep applying, I keep going. And that was, essentially grit is the idea of, do you keep going in the face of adversity? So for one, I think grit is taught earlier on when you have experienced adverse life experiences that force you to keep going. I think that the more gritty people actually might say that they've had more challenges in their lifetime. Can you teach it? Perhaps, but I think that, for the most part, it is, part of cognitive behavioral therapy, as I think as a psychologist, part of it is like sort of testing these automatic assumptions and actually doing like an experiment, like, this is what you think will happen. Let's see what happens if you actually go out there to do it. And you compare what you thought was going to happen compared to what actually happened. That might actually be a mechanism for building grit, is to kind of to almost, encourage people to persevere through something, to then see what happens. And as their self-efficacy is, grows around that area, then, that becomes, perhaps they can become more gritty. But I don't know of any, off the top of my head, in terms of any interventions that are promoting grit or actually successfully teaching people how to be more gritty.
Right, well, there we go. Something else to work on. In the meantime, Mitchell Spezaferi is asked, practically, have you found helpful ways to describe your role as clinical psychologist, neuropsychologist with patients who have less access to medical care, psychology, brain health, et cetera? How do you do it?
That's a good question. How do I describe it? Well, I mean, first, most people that think of neuropsychology say, wow, that's a very long word. And what does that even mean? Are you going to, do something invasive? And so I explain that, just like any organ in the body, we want to see how your brain is functioning, and so essentially we have different tests. Obviously, if you want to see liver function, you do one type of test. If you want to look at heart functioning, you might do an echo or nuclear stress test. We use measures that are designed to mimic the cognitive skills that are needed to function in day-to-day life. And we use those measures to try to look at how your brain is functioning as a proxy of it, because we don't really know. And that's where I'm trying to emphasize, I guess today, hopefully, is that we have a lot of work to do with respect to the cognitive measures that we are presuming that are tapping into brain function. We don't really necessarily know, nor can we really tell by imaging all the time that it doesn't really tell us how somebody is functioning, cognitively. So I try to but in terms of using lay terms, I try to just relate it to how they would understand other organs being evaluated in terms of their function.
Very good. Thank you. And then I think this is going to have to be our last question. And good news is I think you've already partially answered it, but it's from Qmars Lalezarzadeh. Boy, these names are challenging me. I think I got it almost right. Anyhow, thank you for a wonderful talk. You showed the priming effect of group disparity affecting cognitive load and poor performance. What do you think might happen to the performance if the interviewer is of the same color, racial, ethnic group? And I think one of your experiments already did address that in part. But then what if the interview could use a mimesis using the same dialect? Do you think that would affect the performance?
That's a good question. Well, in the stereotype threat study, we saw that the stereotype threat effect persisted regardless of the race of the examiner. Because initially I thought, oh, maybe if the instructions are said by an examiner who's the same race, it would have less of an effect or attenuated, and we did not see that. But and that's, I think, just kind of gives credit to the fact that the stereotype threat effect can be very strong when elicited. But I don't know in terms of if the same language component was used. I think it's a good question. I think there's a lot of work that still needs to be done in that area. This was just one study that was, we had like 97 people, so it's not super representative, but it's a good start to be able to answer these more complex questions and to also consider other types of variables that might interact with the stereotype threat effect.
Well, that's really fantastic. And I think that we're so lucky to have you here where, we can begin to perhaps build in some techniques to help train our students in how to minimize stereotype threat effects and begin to use that as an empirical basis for correcting some of these problems. We're out of time for questions. There's one final comment from Susan Buchheimer. Awesome talk, April.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Buchheimer.
I agree with Dr. Buchheimer. Thank you so much.
Thank you.